This is a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson in New York, where the closing bell on Wall Street just rang. The markets closed down. The Dow slid roughly 1,600 points. The S&P 500 fell more than 4.5%. And the Nasdaq dropped nearly 6%. This comes just a day after President Trump announced his new tariff plan, which begins Saturday to charge at least 10% on imports from every country. The president also announced even higher reciprocal tariffs from 60 countries he calls, quote, the worst offenders. And that those are places that export more to the U.S. than the U.S. exports to them. Mr. Trump called the plan America's, quote, declaration of economic independence. But Americans could pay the price for these new charges. With me now is Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, so what's just your broadest response to what the markets have done today?
Well, on a day like this, I always like to put it in perspective of how big of a loss this was. So you have to go back to 2020 for each of these three major indexes, the Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq, to see a single day that saw a greater loss. And so what does that mean? That was COVID.
Yeah.
Right? Investors are looking at today and sort of, at least in terms of how the market reacted, putting these two equal. Now, three reasons, I think, why there was so much of a sell-off. Investors really did not price in those reciprocal tariffs. It was not expected. We expected it to be a smaller amount of countries.
They guessed wrong.
They guessed wrong, right. Exactly.
This is a big, sweeping, massive move, whereas they thought, oh, he might tinker, he might do, but... Okay.
Exactly. And I mean, we had been talking about uncertainty for the longest time, and so it really plays into that. What they're also thinking is there's going to be the potential for higher prices, higher inflation, and maybe the consumer pulls back on spending. This was also not just Wall Street looking at how companies are going to do, but how Main Street is going to do, that the consumers are going to feel pain. And you sort of put that all together, and it could mean an economic slowdown. Now, investors might be wrong. There's, daily fluctuations, and long term, this could mean good news. But in the short term, investors bet that this was not going to be good news.
Right. Now, were there sectors that, well, let's talk about the Nasdaq and technology companies. A lot of them do their manufacturing outside of the United States. The theory behind the president's plan is that this is going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. But that doesn't happen overnight. These companies have to manage that.
No, it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without billions and billions of dollars of investment. Tech was really hit hard. So the S&P 500, it lost $2 trillion, nearly $2 trillion in value. Nearly half of that came from 7 big tech stocks. And I highlight that because there's a couple of things when you think about tech and losses there. So Apple's a really good example. A lot of these companies, they have manufacturing in China. It's going to be really hard to bring that here, as you just mentioned. But it's also a big market for them. And China is likely to retaliate. And so that was what you saw flow through some of the tech stocks. But if you were looking at your 401k today, you probably also said, oh, no. And that is because tech drives the S&P 500, as I just said, and a lot of your 401k is invested in funds that track the S&P 500.
I think investors best not look at their 401k on a day like this. Kelly, thank you. We're going to go to Nancy Cordes now at the White House. First, we're going to listen to the president, who spoke to reporters just an hour before the markets closed. And here's what President Trump had to say.
I think it's going very well. It was an operation, like when a patient gets operated on, and it's a big thing. I said this would exactly be the way it is. We have $6 or $7 trillion coming into our country, and we've never seen anything like it. The markets are going to boom, the stock is going to boom, the country is going to boom, and the rest of the world wants to see, is there any way they can make a deal? They've taken advantage of us for many, many years. For many years, we've been at the wrong side of the ball. And I'll tell you what, I think it's going to be unbelievable.
Let's turn now to Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. So, Nancy, that's a shortened version of what the president said yesterday in his much longer speech. What are you hearing from the White House here today? They did expect this, but then again, these are big numbers.
The message from the president and everyone on down today here at the White House, John, is that this is a blip, nothing to see here. The patient is going to be much better off after this operation. They simply do not accept what most economists around the world, even right-leaning economists, are saying about these tariffs, which is that they will raise unemployment and raise prices for Americans. And for the president specifically, John, at this point, after today's losses, the stock market has dropped by about 10% since he took office about 2.5 months ago. This is the kind of thing that he predicted would happen when he was on the campaign trail if Kamala Harris were to win. It's one of the worst starts for any president in the modern era.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. We're joined now by CBS News senior business and technology correspondent Jolene Kent. Jolene, you've been hearing from small businesses. What are you hearing? What do they think the future looks like?
So many small businesses feel this sense of anxiety and worry about the future. They've already, John, been struggling when it comes to persistent inflation, high interest rates to borrow money, say to build out your business, and the ongoing softening of consumer confidence, consumer sentiment overall. So that's what they're already facing, plus that uncertainty about tariffs. Now, as we look ahead, a lot of these small businesses, I'm hearing that they are going to be pulling back on orders. There's confusion about what the tariffs and how they were actually calculated will impact their ability to get supplies when it comes to basic textiles across the board. And what's really interesting is we already hear from small businesses across the board, according to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, for example, which is, by the way, often been quite bullish on the Trump administration's agenda. They have said in their recent survey, uncertainty is high and rising on Main Street, and confidence that the economy will continue to grow is fading. Now, remember, small businesses make up such a huge part of the labor market, of the economy, of GDP, of where people are spending their money. And so this uncertainty really feels different this time around. It feels like some of the promises from President Trump's campaign are really falling off, because now, with the market sliding and so much more prevailing anxiety for these small business owners, they feel like their back is up against a wall in a lot of ways. And this is interesting because it's hitting across, different retailers and suppliers and people who make all kinds of different things and do all kinds of different services, from retail to hospitality. We're feeling and hearing that the anxiety is real.
It's a great point, and the White House often makes the distinction between Wall Street and Main Street. They say Wall Street may have its own idiosyncrasies, but Main Street's where it's at. What you've just been describing is right in the center of Main Street, being felt both in Wall Street and Main Street. CBS's Ramy Inocencio joins me from London. Ramy, how are those allies responding to these trade actions?
Well, John, it has been a rough day, continues to be, and around the world, it's blanket frustration, confusion, and anger. And it's presidents and its prime ministers from Europe to Asia huddling with their advisors and their business leaders, trying to really figure a way to make sure, basically, that their economies don't break. Here are some of those world leaders.
There seems to be no order in the disorder, no clear path through the complexity and chaos.
The administration's tariffs have no basis in logic, and they go against the basis of our two nations partnership.
Nobody wins in a trade war. That is not in our national interest.
French President Emmanuel Macron called Trump's tariffs a catastrophe. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that they're an attack on a system. He pointed out that America itself helped achieve post-World War II. Basically, to your question, John, no one outside the United States, that is saying that this is a good thing.
Well, and there's, as you know, plenty of disagreement here in the States. Ramy, okay, so they don't like it, but are they listening to the warnings that they should not respond, the warnings from the administration?
For the most part, yes, but for now, John. At this point, the most concrete pushback we're seeing is coming from Canada to the north. Prime Minister Mark Carney says that Ottawa will impose 25% tariffs on U.S.-made automobiles that right now don't comply with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA. So that means vehicles that don't have at least 75% of its parts made in North America. But elsewhere in the world, there are threats, many threats of retaliation, but nothing concrete, like European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen saying that the EU is preparing countermeasures, but ultimately it looks like many are hoping to negotiate. The idea here, the fear here, John, is that if you retaliate, Trump might double, might even triple down on more tariffs.
That's right. Remy Inocencio in London for us. Thank you so much. For more on the potential global and domestic ripple effects of these tariffs, I'm joined by Maurice Obstfeld. He is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you so much for joining me. For the everyday person just wading into this trade tariff war, what can you help them understand exactly what is happening now that the president has made this move?
Well, stock markets are obviously tumbling around the world, as you've reported. We're waiting to see many of the tariffs go into effect. Once they do, prices for domestic consumers in the U.S. and businesses will rise soon after. And of course, foreign countries are shocked, and some of them panicked and trying to figure out how they want to respond to this, which is really an attack by President Trump on the global trading system.
What are the kinds of decisions companies are having to make right now that had a big trading practice?
Well, this is very different from what a uniform across-the-board tariff would have been, what President Trump basically campaigned on, because different tariff rates apply to different countries. And so, if you have an extended global supply chain, you're wondering if you need to source from different countries, source from low-tariff countries. That causes a lot of uncertainty. It causes switching costs. It's a very disruptive process. And that, I think, is going to disrupt global trade even more than a simple uniform tariff would have done.
Explain switching costs. I was talking to a business today that was just talking about the churn of trying to pivot and what that's going to cost them.
Well, I mean, imagine that you're sourcing rubber from Indonesia, which has a pretty high tariff rate. You can also source it from Liberia, which has a 10% tariff rate. But then you need to find new suppliers. The costs of moving stuff out of Liberia are much higher, and it can take time, and it costs a lot of money. So I don't think any of these importing firms are happy about this at all.
And finally, the president said America had been, quote, looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far and denied a turn to prosper. That was his description of U.S. trade before. In about the 30 seconds we have left, what was the trade picture before?
Well, I'm not sure what he's thinking of, maybe the 19th century, but America fostered a multilateral, rules-based global trading system after World War II. It helped America prosper. It helped the world prosper. And America is still the most prosperous country on earth. So I don't really find his condemnation of the global trading system and his characterization as of the U.S. as being a victim is really very convincing.
Although their policy will hurt American families, until that pain becomes impossible to ignore, I do not believe they will change direction. So the road to that point may indeed be long.
That was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney doing what a lot of world leaders are doing today, trying to predict the future of President Trump's tariff regime and the implications thereof and how long it's going to last. For perspective on this and how it's affecting, at least today and perhaps in the next couple of days, the global economy, I want to bring in the global economics reporter for Bloomberg, Enda Curran. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Major.
So how would you summarize today's global economic reaction to the Trump tariffs?
I think people are talking about a shock that reminds them of maybe early in the pandemic. It's that kind of systematic fallout. You have economists now downgrading their forecasts for the US economy and downgrading their growth forecast for the global economy. And take China, for example. It's especially vulnerable to this trade war with the US. Some estimates there that up to 80% of Chinese exports could be impacted by these new tariffs. So certainly a shock on growth and trade around the world.
And one of the things that struck me today, listening to the analysts looking at the market reaction, was there had been an expectation that the markets had priced in the tariffs, but they were larger and more sweeping than the markets expected. That's why there was a downturn today. And that was not just in the U.S.-based markets, global ones as well.
That's right. I think, as people are saying, it wasn't just a worst-case scenario, probably worse than the worst-case scenario. That's the way a lot of people are framing it today, the breadth and the scope of those tariffs. And not just on, key trading rivals, say China, for example, being the obvious one, but across the scope of economic allies, across some of the key hubs, trading hubs of Asia, Vietnam being an obvious one, for example. So there's a feeling now that A, this is going to mean more expensive goods in the near term, no matter what. B, companies are going to have to reshuffle and move around their supply lines. That's going to be very expensive with knock-on impacts on investment and jobs.
And when the president says, as I quoted him directly a few moments ago on Air Force One, the operation is over, but also tariffs give us great power to negotiate. It creates this uncertainty. Well, what is it? Are these the rates? Or is there a negotiated way to try to peel them back somehow?
Well, we're certainly getting hints of an aggressive response from trading partners already before we get to negotiations. So France and Germany, officials there talking today about pulling whatever levers they can to retaliate against these US tariffs. French President Macron saying French companies should stop investing in the US for the moment. And of course, China overnight saying that they're looking at ways to retaliate and will do so as well. Now, maybe we do get to this negotiation point, but right here, right now, we feel like we're at the ugly end of this trade war.
And what investors are worrying about is everything sort of locking up.
Oh, very much so.
Stalling.
Companies not making decisions to expand, companies putting hiring on hold. We'll get employment data for the US tomorrow that might start to give us some hints if it is having an impact. And of course, investors pulling their money out of America and going into the dollar today, for example, had a 1.5% fall. Instead, the euro and the yen rallying as a result. Question marks over dollar safe haven status. So, negative response. To be clear, the administration says it will generate jobs, it will bring manufacturing back to the US, near-term pain, long-term gain. But what I'm just telling you today is that the initial reaction is fairly downbeat.
And I'd like your perspective on how the world looks at the U.S. economy, because I looked at these statistics today, they jumped out at me. The United States accounts for 5% of global population, 25% of global GDP. We're a colossus, and everyone around the world knows that. And if we start throwing our elbows around, I have to think that they're going to be protective of themselves and their own economy, not just because it's angering them, but because they feel like they must.
Yeah, that's the expectation now, that when the US puts up this kind of a trading wall, the biggest sweep of tariffs in a century, we haven't seen this before, now other governments are going to respond. They're going to put up their own tariffs and put up their own protective measures to protect their own economies and their own goods against the US. And that's the danger, that's what people are warning about, that we get into this spiral now of a tit-for-tat retaliatory trade war that obviously hurts global growth. Lots of warnings today. JP Morgan tonight coming out with a figure of about 60% chance now of a global recession. References back to the Smoot-Hawley era and the Great Depression. You might say some of those cases are maybe extreme. We don't know yet. It's still early in this process, but the point is there are lots of warning signs about where this could be going.
Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul has emerged as kind of a prominent critic of President Trump's approach to tariffs. Among the arguments he's recently made is they might not fit within the Constitution. Listen.
Not only bad, tariffs are bad economically, it's not good form for a constitutional republic to have taxes raised by one person. When our Constitution was written, it said taxes originate in Congress, and more specifically, they originate in the House. So there's nothing about this that's consistent with our constitutional republic.
I want to bring in our political panel. Jaime Moore was Chief of Staff to former DNC Chair Jamie Harrison. Mara Gillespie served as an advisor to former House Speaker John Boehner and former Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Jaime, let me start with you. Give me your evaluation from a Democratic perspective on what we've seen this week and Rand Paul's argument that whether you like them or not, there's a process that's not even being adhered to.
Yeah. Look, I think we said this before. I think Democrats have a lot of fodder to fight back on Donald Trump's agenda. So I think this week has made very clear that Donald Trump has done things unilaterally that are not going to make American lives better. And so I think Democrats, Cory Booker, senator from New Jersey, was just on TV yesterday, and he laid it out sort of very well. Democrats don't have to do anything except reiterate what Donald Trump's doing. And so he said he would take costs down. He has not taken costs down. He's actually added a tax to people with these tariffs. I was talking to the footwear industry today, the folk over there, and they were saying people are going to go from buying 3 pairs of shoes to 1 pair of shoes. It's going to get increasingly more difficult to live in this country, and I think Democrats have to say that.
To that point, and I'm not a Nike customer, pro or con. Yeah. I'm just looking at what Nike did several years ago. Under urging from the U.S. government, it moved its manufacturing facilities out of China largely to Vietnam.
Correct.
Now they're in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And Vietnam is going to face a 46% tariff.
Yep. I mean,
and so that creates an issue for the cost of a sneaker.
Yeah, and you're talking about families. If you think of a family of 5. The parents have to buy shoes, the kids have to buy shoes for school, and then think about the curricular activities they do: football, basketball, dance, all of that. And so I think people are going to start seeing these things affect their lives a lot sooner than they thought. And so Democrats are going to have to go back to the American people and say, this is bad, and Donald Trump is doing the wrong thing. However, this is our agenda. And so I think, Rand Paul was very, very sincere about his critiques about these tariffs. And it's all true. These tariffs are not going to make the economy better overnight. It's going to make it a lot harder to do things you want to do.
Mara, you're familiar with the conversations within Republican circles. And I know Rand Paul brought up the constitutional argument, not only because he believes in it, he's pretty consistent there, but I think he's hopeful that some Republicans might actually heed that as something that's worth considering, quite separate from whatever they may believe economically or politically about tariffs.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I don't often find myself on the same side as Rand Paul, but here we are. But he's right. Largely Republicans have lost their way as far as what we stand for. And the separation of powers, the importance of the Constitution, and recognizing where the authority comes from to make these decisions is important. But you're seeing Republicans largely place their trust in President Trump and hope that, these short-term pains, as he's calling them, will lead to those long-term gains. The unfortunate part is that right now it's a hypothetical. It is a potential long-term gain. There's no guarantees, and it's to be seen whether voters can hang on during these upheavals of grocery costs going up, of your clothing and your footwear going up, and some of these tariffs that are placed not based on individual cases and looking into the country, but by an algorithm that is, I think in some cases, really impersonal and not really going to be effective and quite possibly very damaging.
And Mara, just to get into this at a slightly more granular level of detail, the president does have authority to declare an emergency and therefore invoke tariffs. Any president can do that. But if you say it's an emergency and then the next day say it's still open to negotiation, well, what is it? A negotiation or an emergency? And I think that's what Rand Paul's driving at.
And I think that's exactly what he's driving at. His reasoning isn't passing the smell test, as my former boss, John Boehner, would say. And again, Rand Paul is right in that this needs to be a conversation about the merit of these tariffs and each one. Again, the blanket statements, the blanket tariffs, as opposed to looking into each individual case, is where Republican senators have a right to be frustrated with and can potentially bring that up to the president in these conversations, because we don't know that our allies or other countries are going to be coming to the negotiating table. We don't know that that's a possibility, sure, but there are no guarantees there, which leaves things kind of in an upheaval here.
I mean, you mentioned Senator Cory Booker. I don't want to gloss over this because he did something a little outside the box this week. He stood on the floor of the Senate for 25 hours. It wasn't a filibuster. It was just a long speech, a very long speech, a lot of letters from constituents. Does that carry any weight beyond this week? Is it something more than symbolic? Does it give Democrats a way of thinking about articulating this moment and perhaps galvanizing it in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was historic, and I think the senator deserves a lot of kudos for that. But I think here's the reality of that. I think people have asked Democrats to fight back. And Democrats, for a long time, for the last few months, have not known how to do that. And so I think Cory Booker is now laying out a new blueprint for how to be smart about fighting back. If there are moments where you can stop the train, you should stop the train. If there are moments you can be, you can offer a smarter perspective, you should do that. And so I think over the next couple of months, you'll see in the states, the governors, the mayors are going to start doing a little bit more to stop Donald Trump's agenda.
And Mara, let's talk about this broader conversation around the economy in a way that I know the administration wants to. I'm not doing them any favors. I'm just articulating what they say out loud, which is tariffs are part of it, but we're also going to do deregulatory things, which Republicans support. We're going to cut taxes, which Republicans support, and those things in totality will make things better. Evaluate that part of the White House pushback.
Certainly. Well, the messaging there is important because we should be looking at ways to produce more things here. Manufacturing, deregulating so that we can have more manufacturing here. When I worked for Congressman Kinzinger, one of the bills we introduced was the Made in the Americas Act, and it was to incentivize companies to come to this hemisphere and receive some sort of incentive to do so through deregulation, through tax incentives, because we do want to have more American products, American-made products. again, I think that looking at it through an individual basis as opposed to blanket policy is going to be really important. And this approach by the White House to try and couch the major concerns people are having with the tariff announcement last night is smart. They're also doing a bit of red meat. If you've heard the president talking about we're being taken advantage of, that is working with his base. So they're going to be willing to hang on a little longer. I think they're going to support the president, and you're seeing that with Mike Johnson and others in the House that aren't worried about losing their authority over having regulations or having the say in those things because they are giving the president the benefit of the doubt right now. But that's to be seen because we have a gubernatorial race coming up here in November with Virginia and New Jersey. And then, of course, down the road, we have the midterms.
And Haima, really for Democrats, what they have to hope for, because they lost this conversation in November on the economy, who's right? They lost it. That all the Democrats can hope for, structurally, maybe they nurse it along, but that there's buyer's remorse among those constituents that you once held that you lost to Trump.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're starting to see that. And I think one of the things that President Trump did was over-index on his relationship with Elon Musk. And Democrats have been very smart about making sure that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are the picture of dysfunction and bad governing. And so I think Democrats have to build on that. We can't just say Donald Trump is bad, his policies are bad. What is the agenda? What sort of policies will Democrats want to do to make the economy stronger? We know that Joe Biden did not wreck the economy. The economy was reeling from COVID. Donald Trump was the president at that time. And so we're going back into a phase where Donald Trump's telling us one thing, and we're literally watching another thing happen. I think the real question we have to ask, will this help our competitiveness? Will this make America more competitive in the global market? And I don't think it will. And I, like Tamar's point, we want to bring jobs back to this country. Democrats, Republicans, independents want to have good American jobs, but we also want to be competitive. We want to have good universities. We want to have good colleges and good hospitals. And we want to be innovative in AI and technology. And so some of the things that Donald Trump's been doing over the last couple months goes against that goal.
Sweeping tariffs from the Trump administration that impact imported vehicles and certain foreign-made auto parts went into effect Thursday morning. Goldman Sachs estimates that the auto tariffs could raise prices between $5,000 and $15,000, depending on the vehicle's make, model, and manufacturing location. Even U.S. manufactured automobiles could see price increases up to $8,000 because of the imported parts they contain. About half of all vehicles sold in the U.S. were assembled in America, according to a Cars.com report. But there's no such thing as a 100% made in America automobile because of imported parts and basic materials like steel. A 1992 law called the American Automobile Labeling Act requires companies to report to the government how many parts used in their vehicles come from the U.S. and Canada or other nations. Tesla, for example, manufactures 100% of its vehicles in the U.S., but depending on the model, up to 40% of its parts come from places outside America or Canada. The average automobile insurance premium could also rise 19%, according to digital insurance agent Insurify, because vehicles will become more expensive to repair. CBS News' Money Watch team found some brands will be more impacted than others. 55% of GM supply is made outside the U.S. Non-American companies, including Toyota, Honda, Kia, and Hyundai, all manufacture a large percentage of their automobiles in other countries and import many of the parts for vehicles that are made stateside. It's not guaranteed that all companies will pass costs from tariffs directly onto consumers, but some say, at least some say they will. Italian automobile maker Ferrari announced it will raise prices by 10% because of the tariffs. The Southern Shrimp Alliance, which represents the U.S. shrimp industry, is praising the Trump administration's tariffs on nearly all foreign imports. In a statement Wednesday, John Williams, the executive director of the nonprofit organization, said the president's tariffs will, quote, preserve American jobs, food security, and our commitment to ethical production. Williams added, quote, if we wait for systemic reforms, we will lose our domestic shrimp industry. To put that into context, the Southern Shrimp Alliance says more than 90% of all U.S. shrimp and seafood is imported from overseas. The top three suppliers of shrimp to the U.S. are India, which has a tariff rate of 26%, Ecuador, which has a tariff rate of 10%, and Indonesia, which has a tariff rate of 32%. For more, let's bring in Leanne Bossard. She's a board member representing Mississippi for the Southern Shrimp Alliance, and she and her family have long worked in the fishing and shrimping industries, operating a fleet of vessels in the Gulf and South Atlantic. Leanne, first off, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Can you outline how previous policies have hurt the shrimping industry?
So first, you need to understand probably that the U.S. domestic shrimp industry is made up of small, multi-generational fishing family businesses. And so for the last 2 decades, those small businesses have actually been trying to combat the unfair trade on a global scale. If you can imagine how daunting a task that is. And yesterday, I think our industry finally felt like we had a recognition from yes, the top, the US president, but also policymakers and trade representatives that this unfair trade does in fact exist, that we have been fighting it, that we need help, and that it's time for change, that it has to be addressed.
How did exports become such a big part of the business?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
How did exports become such a big part of the business? How is it that you guys are having to face such an uphill climb when it comes to foreign producers of seafood?
So that's actually part of the unfair trade. If you look at what has brought on the development of this overseas foreign shrimp aquaculture industry, it is subsidies, right? Our US tax dollars go to the government, and then some of those tax dollars get funneled to international financial institutions like the World Bank, for example. They have had an interest for many decades now in shrimp aquaculture overseas, and they have actually used those dollars to fund the infrastructure necessary to build up that overseas aquaculture industry, which then takes that product that was subsidized and ships it right back into our US markets for our US industry, which is not subsidized, to compete directly against. And that's just one of the unfair trade practices.
Is it an overstatement to say the president's announcement Wednesday will save your business?
It is the first step towards saving our industry. What it gave us was immediate relief, because honestly, our industry is at a precipice. If we don't have some sort of immediate relief, I don't know that you'll have any more multi-generational fishing families. I don't know that my son will be in the business, or his son or daughter after him. So yesterday gave us immediate relief, and that immediate relief is going to buy us enough time to hopefully address the systemic reforms that are needed to stamp out this unfair trade in the foreign overseas aquaculture industry.
I am out of time with you, but I do want to ask, why do you think it should be important to consumers that they consume domestic aquaculture?
That they consume domestic wild caught product, because our product is actually wild caught. So it's an all natural product. We're sustainably managed, and we feed America. That's what we want to do. We are an industry of hardworking fishermen. We want nothing more than to go out and make an honest living and provide a protein for our American citizens. So if you can buy American, please, we need it desperately.
Leanne Beausarge, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
American business owners who import products from China will be subject to a 34% tariff on goods on top of the 20% blanket tariffs that were already imposed. So 54% for anyone doing that math at home. David Morrow joins us now. He's the founder of JesusDoll.com, a plush toy business. David, you worked at Salesforce before you started this business. This is your income now. How much do you import from China or rely on China or other countries for your business?
Yeah. Hey, Lindsay, we've been in business 3 years, and we've been working with a manufacturer in China from day one to produce a product, to refine it, to make it better, to even to make more products. So we're entirely reliant on that production, their industry over there. Now, when we started making toys in America, that didn't exist. That industry does not exist here. Making plush toys, like you're showing on the screen, that industry does not exist here. So we had no other option than to look overseas.
What are you expecting in terms of cost when you get your next shipment? And what will you do? Will you absorb that, or will you have to pass it on?
Yeah, so we have a shipment right now that's leaving port in China, and it'll be, when it gets here, it's about $60,000 worth of goods. And when it gets here, we're going to get hit with a, you just did the math there, 54%. That's about $30,000+. I got to stroke a check for $30,000 and get nothing for it.
To the U.S. government.
That's tough for a small business to do. That's tough for an individual to do. That hurts, right? So, we're going to have to take out a loan, maybe, dip into our child's college education. But we've got to get that money back. So we'll have to raise prices. We'll have to pass that along. And, when you raise prices, you don't sell as much, and you have a whole interconnected downstream effect of that. Our retailers will get squeezed between our price increases and what the consumer is willing to pay. So there's a lot of trouble ahead, depending on how long this lasts. But it's definitely going to hurt me in about 2 months.
What about the argument this will increase U.S. manufacturing?
Well, this industry and a lot of industries in America that are being affected by these tariffs, they were hollowed out over decades and decades and decades. You can't just flip a switch and all of a sudden, hey, all factories are sprouting up everywhere. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of investment, it takes a lot of building supply chains and talent and capability. That's not something that happens overnight. So, if we all go to zero and everybody's trading freely, that's great. But if you have an industry like shrimp, you have to protect. I understand that. That's great. But there's no industry in my business to protect. So it's just a punitive tax essentially on the American consumer. And that just dislocates all the business that's happening. And it just creates a lot of chaos for guys like me and customers like mine.
Do you worry this will put you out of business?
No, I don't, because we're gonna push along. We're gonna do everything we know how to do. We're gonna pray. We're gonna obey, and God's gonna show us a way. So we're not worried right now.
All right. Well, David Morrow, thank you for sharing your story with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.